Welcome to Warriors of the World. Today we'll be exploring the extraordinary life and military genius of Saladin, the warrior sultan who reclaimed Jerusalem and changed the course of the Crusades. Subscribe now to join our community and support this project. Now, let's begin. From humble origins to becoming the most feared and respected Muslim commander of the medieval era, Saladin's rise represents one of history's most remarkable journeys to power. Born Yusuf ibn Ayyub in 1137 in Tikrit, modern-day Iraq, to a Kurdish family of modest means, nothing predicted his ascent to become the sultan who would unite the Islamic world against European Crusaders. Historian Andrew Ehrenkreutz challenges the romanticized view of Saladin's early life, arguing that his rapid rise owed more to his uncle Shirkuh's political connections than personal merit. However, as Bernard Hamilton documents, once given opportunity, Saladin's natural leadership and strategic mind quickly distinguished him from contemporaries. Trained initially as a diplomatic administrator rather than a warrior, young Saladin served in the court of Nur ad-Din, the Syrian ruler who dreamed of uniting Muslim territories against the Crusader states. When his uncle Shirkuh conquered Egypt in 1169, Saladin accompanied him and, upon Shirkuh's sudden death, was appointed vizier of Egypt at only 31 years old, a shocking appointment that many expected to fail. Instead, Saladin consolidated power with remarkable speed, abolishing the Fatimid Caliphate which had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries and restoring Sunni Islam. When his former master Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin seized control of Syria as well, creating a unified Muslim front surrounding the Crusader territories for the first time since their establishment. What separated Saladin from other ambitious medieval rulers was his ability to frame power consolidation as religious duty. As historian Thomas Bridge notes, he transformed ruthless political ambition into a holy mission, creating the foundation for what would become his greatest achievement, the reconquest of Jerusalem. When Saladin declared himself sultan in 1174, few believed his fragile coalition of territories would survive. The Muslim world was deeply fractured along sectarian, ethnic, and political lines. His audacious claim to rule both Egypt and Syria represented an unprecedented power grab that drew immediate challenges from rival Muslim rulers. Historian Carol Hillenbrand emphasizes that Saladin's genius lay not in battlefield tactics alone, but in his systematic approach to empire building. Before confronting the Crusader kingdoms, he spent nearly a decade securing his flanks and establishing legitimacy through a combination of military campaigns, strategic marriages, and diplomatic maneuvering. His first challenge came from Damascus, where rivals rejected his authority. Rather than launching a frontal assault, Saladin implemented what military historian David Nicole terms strategic patience. He blockaded the city while simultaneously distributing gold to influential citizens inside, eventually securing its surrender without a costly siege. This pattern, combining military pressure with generous terms for those who submitted, became his signature approach. Between 1174 and 1186, Saladin methodically expanded his territory, capturing Aleppo, Mosul, and other key cities while neutralizing the assassin sect, Nizari Ismailis, that had terrorized Muslim rulers for generations. Unlike many conquerors, he rarely executed defeated opponents, instead incorporating them into his administration, a practice that Yale historian Paul M. Cobb calls conquest through cooptation. British historian P.H. Newby points to Saladin's economic reforms as equally important as his military campaigns. He standardized currency, lowered taxes on essential goods, and established WACs, charitable endowments, supporting public works. These measures generated popular support that proved crucial during later military campaigns. By 1186, Saladin had accomplished what seemed impossible a decade earlier, creating a united Muslim empire stretching from Cairo to Aleppo. As Bernard Lewis notes, he built not merely a collection of territories but a genuine state with functioning institutions, the necessary foundation for his historic confrontation with the Crusaders. What distinguished Saladin from other great military leaders of his era wasn't just battlefield success, but the strict moral code that governed his conduct of war. This warrior's code would make him an anomaly in medieval warfare and eventually earn admiration even from his Christian enemies. Contemporary Muslim chronicler Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who served as Saladin's judge and documented his campaigns firsthand, records that Saladin forbade the killing of prisoners except in rare circumstances, opposed the slaughter of civilian populations, and punished soldiers who mistreated local inhabitants. While some Western historians like Harold Lamb suggest these accounts may be exaggerated for propaganda purposes, archaeological evidence from Crusader-era settlements shows remarkably little destruction during Saladin's reconquest campaigns. Saladin's ethical framework was rooted in Islamic legal traditions of warfare. Military historian John France notes that while Saladin was ruthless when necessary, he strictly followed Quranic injunctions limiting violence against non-combatants and property. This wasn't merely moral posturing but strategic calculation. By treating conquered populations fairly, he reduced resistance and administrative costs. His treatment of religious minorities surprised contemporaries. British historian Malcolm Lyons documents how Saladin allowed Christians and Jews in his territories to maintain their religious practices and legal systems under the dhimmi framework. This policy was remarkable in an era when religious persecution was common practice across both Muslim and Christian realms. Perhaps most unusually for a medieval commander, Saladin maintained a modest personal lifestyle despite his immense power. Ibn Shaddad records that upon Saladin's death, his treasury contained insufficient funds for his funeral, as he had distributed most wealth to his troops and the poor. While some scholars like Anne-Marie Ed question whether this poverty was exaggerated to enhance his reputation for piety, contemporary accounts consistently describe his personal austerity. This combination of military prowess and ethical leadership would be put to its greatest test at the Battle of Hattin, where Saladin's disciplined force would face the might of the Crusader armies in a confrontation that would change the Holy Land forever. The Battle of Hattin on July 4, 1187, represents one of military history's most perfectly executed tactical masterpieces. In a single, decisive engagement, Saladin annihilated the combined Crusader army, effectively ending the 88-year Christian control of Jerusalem. Modern military analysts still study this battle as a textbook example of strategic manipulation of terrain, psychology, and resources. The conflict began with what Israeli archaeologist Ronnie Ellenblum terms strategic provocation. Saladin deliberately violated a truce by attacking a Crusader caravan, knowing this would provoke an emotional rather than rational response from Guy of Lusignan, the inexperienced king of Jerusalem. Contemporary chronicle Itinerarium Peregrinorum describes how more experienced Crusader lords, including Raymond III of Tripoli, urged caution, but were overruled. When the Crusader army marched from its fortified positions, Saladin implemented what historian R.C. Smale calls a tactical withdrawal, retreating while maintaining constant harassment. This drew the heavily armored Crusaders away from water sources during the scorching summer heat. By positioning his forces at the horns of Hattin, Saladin forced the dehydrated Crusader army to attempt a desperate climb toward the Sea of Galilee's distant waters. On July 3, Saladin's light cavalry surrounded the exhausted Crusader forces, who made camp on waterless, exposed ground. That night, as documented by Arab chronicler Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, Saladin ordered brushfires lit around the Crusader camp, intensifying their thirst and fatigue through choking smoke. The following morning, the Crusaders attempted a breakout toward water. Saladin's forces systematically isolated different elements of the Crusader army, destroying them piecemeal. Using the significantly more maneuverable light cavalry, his forces could attack, retreat, and reposition while the Crusader knights, weakened by thirst and heat in their heavy armor, gradually lost cohesion. By day's end, the military might of the Crusader kingdoms lay in ruins. The true cross, Christendom's most sacred relic in Jerusalem, was captured. King Guy and most of the Crusader nobility were prisoners. As military historian David Nicole concludes, Hattin wasn't merely a battle, it was the deliberate disassembly of an army through perfect understanding of its weaknesses. On October 2, 1187, Saladin achieved what had seemed impossible for nearly a century: the Islamic reconquest of Jerusalem. This moment represented not merely a military victory but a profound religious and symbolic triumph that reverberated across the medieval world. After Hattin, most Crusader strongholds fell quickly. With their main field army destroyed, castles and cities surrendered in rapid succession. By September, only Jerusalem, Tyre, and a handful of isolated fortresses remained in Christian hands. Unlike his Christian predecessors who had massacred Jerusalem's population in 1099, Saladin approached the Holy City with strategic restraint. Contemporary historian William of Tyre records the panic that seized Jerusalem's remaining defenders, mostly civilians, women, and children, led by Queen Sibylla and a handful of knights who had escaped Hattin. Initial negotiations failed as Balian of Ibelin, the improvised commander, rejected Saladin's terms, threatening to destroy Islamic holy sites if forced to fight to the end. Historian Thomas S. Bridge highlights how Saladin calibrated his response perfectly. Rather than risking a destructive siege that might damage the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, he offered extraordinarily generous terms, all Christians could purchase their freedom and leave with their movable possessions. The poor who couldn't afford the ransom would be freed through Saladin's personal treasury and contributions from his officers. The contrast with the First Crusade's capture of Jerusalem in 1099 couldn't have been more stark. Where Crusaders had waded through blood up to their ankles, according to their own chroniclers, Saladin's forces entered peacefully. As Muslim chronicler Imad ad-Din recorded, no home was looted, no person harmed. This strategic clemency enhanced Saladin's reputation but also served practical purposes. Christopher Tyerman notes that by avoiding a bloody sack of the city, Saladin prevented damage to Islamic holy sites, maintained his moral authority, and accelerated his subsequent campaigns. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Europe, triggering the massive Third Crusade. But Saladin's ethical conduct in victory became as legendary as the conquest itself, establishing a model of chivalric warfare that would influence military ethics for centuries. The arrival of Richard I of England, the legendary Lionheart, in the Holy Land in 1191 presented Saladin with his greatest military challenge. Their confrontation would produce one of history's most famous warrior rivalries, a chess match between two commanders representing the pinnacle of medieval military leadership. After Jerusalem's fall, Europe mounted the massive Third Crusade, with three monarchs leading separate expeditions: Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, who drowned en route, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England. Richard quickly established himself as the Crusade's primary leader, recapturing the crucial port city of Acre after a prolonged siege. What followed was a series of engagements that military historian John France describes as a masterclass in medieval combined arms warfare. Unlike previous Crusader commanders who relied almost exclusively on heavy cavalry charges, Richard implemented sophisticated tactics integrating infantry, archers, and knights in disciplined formations. The Battle of Arsuf in September 1191 demonstrated both leaders' tactical brilliance. Saladin repeatedly provoked Richard's army during its march along the Mediterranean coast, attempting to disrupt its cohesion. Richard maintained iron discipline, absorbing harassment until the perfect moment, then launching a devastating counterattack. Although Richard won the field, Saladin preserved most of his force through orderly withdrawal. British historian Christopher Tyerman challenges the romanticized view of their rivalry, noting it was primarily conducted through proxies and intermediaries rather than direct contact. Nevertheless, contemporary chronicles from both sides record growing mutual respect. When Richard fell ill with a fever, Saladin sent his personal physician along with ice and fresh fruit. When Richard's horse was killed in battle, Saladin sent a replacement, declaring that a knight of his caliber should not fight on foot. Despite Richard's tactical successes, Saladin's strategic patience prevailed. By controlling the interior while Richard held the coast, Saladin prevented any serious attempt to recapture Jerusalem. As historian Jonathan Phillips observes, Richard could win battles, but Saladin was winning the war through superior strategic position, supply networks, and ability to replace losses. Their confrontation ended not with a decisive battle but a negotiated peace, the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192, that allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem while confirming Muslim control of the city, an outcome that reflected the military stalemate engineered by Saladin's defensive strategy. Saladin's military innovations transformed medieval warfare, particularly his mastery of desert combat conditions that neutralized the traditional advantages of heavily armored European knights. His adaptive approach created a distinctive fighting style that military historians still study for its effectiveness against technologically superior opponents. Unlike European armies with their emphasis on heavily armored cavalry and infantry formations, Saladin built a force optimized for mobility and sustainability in arid environments. Military historian David Nicole identifies several key innovations. First, Saladin maintained a corps of Mamluks, professional slave soldiers, for decisive engagements while using Bedouin and Turkoman light cavalry for reconnaissance, harassment, and cutting enemy supply lines. Second, he revolutionized logistics for desert operations. Unlike Crusader armies that required massive baggage trains, Saladin's forces used camels that could travel 3 days without water while carrying heavier loads than horses. His quartermaster corps developed a system of hidden water caches and supply depots throughout strategic corridors, allowing his armies to appear in areas European commanders considered impassable. Third, Saladin adapted Muslim siege warfare significantly. While earlier Islamic armies often struggled against European castles, Saladin's engineers developed specialized trebuchets that could be disassembled for transport across desert terrain. Historian Hugh Kennedy documents how these mobile siege engines could be reassembled in just 2 days, allowing Saladin to rapidly reduce fortifications that previous Muslim commanders had bypassed. Modern military analyst Kenneth Maxey points to Saladin's use of terrain as his greatest tactical advantage. His forces consistently exploited knowledge of local geography to set ambushes, control key water sources, and force Crusader armies to fight in unfavorable conditions. The devastating victory at Hattin exemplified this approach, using terrain and climate as weapons against a technologically advanced but environmentally vulnerable enemy. Perhaps most innovative was Saladin's psychological warfare. He maintained an extensive intelligence network that included Christian agents, giving him detailed information about enemy movements and internal conflicts. He exploited divisions among Crusader leaders by selectively offering generous terms or harsh treatment based on their political alignments rather than military necessity. This comprehensive approach to warfare, integrating environmental factors, logistics, intelligence, and adaptive tactics, created a military system perfectly tailored to counter European advantages. Behind Saladin's military conquests lay an equally impressive administrative system that transformed the disparate territories under his control into a functioning empire. This governmental innovation, often overshadowed by his battlefield exploits, proved essential to sustaining his campaigns and represents one of his most enduring achievements. Upon gaining control of Egypt in 1171, Saladin inherited a sophisticated but corrupt bureaucracy. Rather than wholesale replacement, historian Yaakov Lev documents how Saladin selectively reformed the administration by promoting officials based on merit rather than connections, regardless of their ethnic or religious background. This meritocratic approach was revolutionary in an era dominated by nepotism and tribal loyalties. His taxation reforms proved particularly significant. Previous rulers had imposed crushing burdens on peasants while exempting military elites. Saladin standardized taxation, reduced rates on agricultural production, and crucially, ensured tax collection served public welfare rather than private enrichment. These policies increased both revenue and popular support, rare achievements for medieval rulers. Financial innovations supported his military campaigns. Medieval economic historian Claude Cahn highlights Saladin's creation of a unified currency system across his territories, facilitating trade and efficient resource allocation. He established a sophisticated treasury system that maintained separate accounts for military expenditure, public works, and religious endowments, preventing the commingling of funds that plagued other medieval administrations. Perhaps most significant was Saladin's development of the Ikta system, land grants to military commanders that carried administrative responsibilities. Unlike European feudalism, these grants weren't hereditary but performance-based. Historian Michael Chamberlain notes this created a meritocratic military aristocracy with direct interest in maintaining local prosperity and security. His urban development projects strengthened key cities as administrative hubs. In Cairo, he built the massive citadel that would serve as Egypt's governmental center for 700 years. In Damascus and Aleppo, he expanded water systems and fortifications while establishing schools and hospitals. Modern governance scholars like Patricia Crone note that Saladin's administration achieved remarkable stability by balancing centralized control with local autonomy. He maintained personal oversight of key functions while delegating day-to-day operations to capable administrators. This system proved so effective that his Ayyubid successors maintained most of its structures for decades after his death. What made Saladin's administrative achievements truly remarkable was their implementation during constant warfare. As historian R. Stephen Humphreys observes, he built a functioning state while simultaneously conducting one of medieval history's most successful military campaigns, a dual accomplishment that few rulers in any era have matched. Saladin's death from fever on March 4, 1193, just months after concluding peace with Richard the Lionheart, marked the end of an era but the beginning of his transformation into a legend that would transcend cultural and religious boundaries. For a man who'd united the Muslim world and reclaimed Jerusalem, his passing was marked by extraordinary simplicity. His personal physician Ibn Jumai recorded that Saladin died possessing so little personal wealth that his treasury lacked sufficient funds for his funeral. The legendary sultan who had commanded vast armies and ruled territories from Egypt to Syria had given away most of his wealth, leaving behind only 47 dirhams and a single gold piece. As historian Jonathan Phillips notes, even in death, Saladin maintained the austere personal habits that had always distinguished him from other rulers of his era. The united realm he built fragmented almost immediately. Despite careful planning, his 17 sons and brother Al-Adil carved his empire into competing states. Within decades, much of his territorial legacy was erased, leading some historians like R. Stephen Humphreys to question the durability of his achievements. Yet his more profound legacy, as a model of Islamic leadership and chivalric warrior, would prove remarkably enduring. In the Muslim world, Saladin became the benchmark against which later rulers measured themselves. The Mamluk sultans who eventually defeated the Mongols explicitly modeled their governance on Saladin's example. Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, who conquered Constantinople in 1453, cited Saladin as his inspiration. Even in modern times, leaders from Gamal Abdel Nasser to Saddam Hussein have invoked Saladin's memory to legitimize their rule. More surprisingly, Saladin achieved posthumous admiration in Europe. Dante placed him among the virtuous pagans in his Divine Comedy, the only Muslim ruler accorded such respect. During the Romantic era, Walter Scott's novel, The Talisman, cemented Saladin's image as the chivalric counterpart to Richard the Lionheart. When Kaiser Wilhelm II visited Damascus in 1898, he commissioned a marble tomb for Saladin, declaring him a knight without fear or blame who often had to teach his opponents the true meaning of knighthood. Perhaps Saladin's most significant legacy was establishing a model of Muslim-Christian relations based on mutual respect rather than absolute enmity. As historian Anne-Marie Ed concludes, in demonstrating that religious conviction and ethical treatment of enemies were compatible, Saladin created a paradigm of warfare that would influence both Islamic and Christian military traditions for centuries. The historical Saladin and the mythological figure that emerged after his death represent one of history's most fascinating studies in legend-making. Separating fact from fiction continues to challenge historians, with recent scholarship revealing a more complex figure than either the perfect Islamic hero or the romanticized chivalric knight of Western imagination. Contemporary Muslim chronicles, particularly those by his companions Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad and Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, present Saladin as a paragon of Islamic virtues, pious, merciful, and devoted to jihad. These accounts, while containing valuable first-hand observations, were consciously crafted to legitimize Saladin's rule and conform to Islamic literary traditions of ideal leadership. In contrast, early Christian sources like William of Tyre portrayed him as a worthy adversary but still a dangerous infidel. This image underwent remarkable transformation over centuries, evolving into the noble Saracen of medieval European Romance literature, culminating in Stanley Lane Poole's influential 1898 biography that depicted Saladin as the very mirror of chivalry. Modern historians take more nuanced approaches. Anne-Marie Ed's groundbreaking research reveals Saladin's careful cultivation of his own image through patronage of poets, historians, and religious scholars who promoted his reputation for piety and justice. She argues his legendary generosity served clear political purposes, buying loyalty and enhancing his prestige. Carol Hillenbrand challenges both Islamic and Western mythmaking, noting Saladin could be ruthlessly pragmatic when necessary. She points to his execution of Reynald of Chatillon after Hattin and his threatened mass execution of Templar and Hospitaller knights as evidence that mercy was conditional rather than absolute in his strategic calculations. Archaeological evidence provides yet another perspective. Recent excavations at Crusader sites conquered by Saladin show limited destruction and rapid economic recovery, suggesting his reputation for clemency has factual basis, whatever his motivations. Perhaps most intriguing is what historian Amin Malouf terms Saladin's dual legacy, simultaneously serving as symbol of Islamic resistance against Western aggression and as model for constructive Muslim-Christian dialogue. During the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Arab forces named their offensive to capture Jerusalem Operation Saladin, while 20th-century peace initiatives between Muslim and Christian communities have equally invoked his example. The historical Saladin, a Kurdish military commander who unified Egypt and Syria, recaptured Jerusalem, and established a dynasty, accomplished enough to secure his place in history. Yet it is the mythological Saladin, warrior, statesman, and symbol of justice, whose impact continues to shape our understanding of religious conflict and reconciliation across centuries and cultures. Subscribe now, become a member, turn on notifications, share this video with your friends, and leave a comment so we can compare our knowledge and sources. Thank you for following our channel. Until our next strategic journey, here at Warriors of the World.